What's up guys, Sagi here and welcome to another Tech Gear Talk. I just spent a couple days shooting with the new Canon EOS R and today I'm going to give you my first impressions. We've been waiting for a few years now for Canon to come out with a full-frame sensor mirrorless camera and I'm super excited to finally have it. If you're following the mirrorless camera space, then you know that Canon definitely has some serious competition. Canon hit a home run with their latest consumer mirrorless camera, the M50, and they usually take their time and make sure they get things right to provide a complete and more thoughtful product instead of rushing to be first to market. But was the wait worth it? And is this really the Canon mirrorless camera that we've been waiting for? This camera has a ton going for it, and there are definitely some areas where I was disappointed and frustrated, and you're gonna hear about both. Before we get going, I'll start out with some overall key features. So the Canon R has an impressive magnesium alloy weather-sealed body with the all-new RF lens mount. It has a 30.3 megapixel 7620 by 4480 full-frame CMOS sensor that uses the dual-pixel autofocus system with 5,655 autofocus points. The Canon R uses the Digic 8 image processor and the autofocus system is sensitive down to -6 EV, which allows focus in incredibly dark conditions. It has a 3.15 fully articulating LCD screen and can output 4K 30 10-bit 422 over HDMI. There is a fantastic high-resolution OLED electronic viewfinder and a new programmable multifunction bar. It can shoot continuously at up to 8 frames per second and offers a native ISO of 40,000. And finally, the EOS R has Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, so you can easily move images and video to your mobile device and even control the camera remotely for both photography and video. Alright, enough with the specs. I'll publish a more detailed review in a few weeks, but I wanted to share my first impressions with you. Let's start out by talking about the aesthetics and feel. And this isn't something that I normally talk about when I'm reviewing a camera, but I can't help myself. The moment I took this camera out of the box, I was immediately smitten. And there isn't really anything that I can specifically point out. I'd seen tons of pictures of it before I got it, but it looks so refined and has such a great feel. Now, of course, there's no comparing it to something like the M50 or the SL2, but even next to a 5D Mark III, it just looks and feels nice. I think that how a camera feels in my hand is super important. And independent of specs and performance, some cameras just feel better. In this case, I think it has to do with the fact that the EOS R feels more like a DSLR than a mirrorless camera, and I wonder if that was intentional on Canon's part. It would make sense to me that if Canon wanted to make the transition seamless for DSLR users, that they would use this type of design. And this overall feel extends even to shooting, so when you take a picture, it almost feels like you're using a DSLR. Alright, as I mentioned earlier, the EOS R comes with a super impressive 30.3 megapixel full-frame CMOS sensor. This is essentially the same sensor on the 5D Mark IV that came out in 2016, but uses the new RF mount. And Canon says that this new shorter lens mount will allow them to design and build smaller or better lenses than the EF mount. And based on what the EF mount offers, that's saying a lot. So essentially you're getting the image and video quality of a 5D Mark IV at around the same price as a 6D Mark II. This had me excited and I was looking forward to using a full frame sensor again, especially for that extra shallow depth of field. So far this is all sounding really good, so let's move on to actually using the EOS R. I picked up the camera, I attached the new lens, the new RF mount feels super solid. I'm in this room, so there are lights on over here, but the other half is super dark. So I looked through the electronic viewfinder and whoa, like it was insane. The image was large and bright and the camera had no problems focusing in the dark. So I'm super impressed so far. The fully articulating touchscreen is one of my favorite features in Canon cameras, and this one is large, bright, and responsive. Still doing great. I took my first picture, looked at it, went to change my exposure, and wait, what? Like, what mode am I in? There's no traditional mode dial. Now, of course, I'm not gonna look at the manual, that would just be ridiculous. So I take a deep breath, I start looking at the controls. There's a really nice LCD screen at the top that shows you what mode you're in, and there's a new mode button and dial here. So I put it in manual and I move on. There's a shutter speed control dial next to the shutter release button, like many other Canon cameras, and an aperture dial at the top instead of the rotary one on the 5Ds. Not what I'm used to, but I quickly got the hang of it. The MFN or multifunction button at the top lets me make changes to ISO, drive mode, autofocus method, white balance, and exposure compensation. So I'm pretty happy now with how quickly I can make adjustments. What I couldn't get used to is this new multifunction touch bar in the back. No thank you, nope. You see, in theory, it makes perfect sense. You can set it to control something like ISO, and then you can slide your thumb left or right to make adjustments. You can also set the left and right areas as buttons and then assign specific functions to each one. So what could be easier than that? Pretty much anything. The biggest problem is inconsistency. We're talking about something that's designed to help you quickly make adjustments, but it's way too easy to swipe past the option that you want, and then you have to swipe back in the other direction, and I end up feeling like a really bad autofocus system that's hunting for focus. Now next, it's just too touchy, and it's in a spot where you're super likely to activate it by accident. You can delay the responsiveness in the settings, but now you have to press it and then wait a second for it to activate before you can start making adjustments. So you just slowed me down even more. I've used or played around with pretty much every DSLR and mirrorless camera that Canon's released in the last 10 years, and I've never had such a frustrating user experience. One of the reasons why I recommend Canon to so many people is the outstanding ergonomics. And so far, this multifunction bar is a miss in my book. What I did was disable it altogether for now, and this camera offers so much flexibility in terms of how you can set the controls that I just don't see why I would need it. My goal is to always give you honest, real-life feedback, so I'll turn it back on and I'll try to use it more and see where that takes me. I'm keeping an open mind and hoping that within a few weeks, I take it all back and tell you how much I love this new multifunction touch bar, but so far it's not off to a good start. All right, let's move on to my initial impressions of the EOS R in terms of image quality. You'll be happy to know that this camera takes some really great photographs. We already discussed the sensor, and I've always been a fan of Canon's color science. Overall, the JPEG performance is really strong. The colors are great, and the images are very sharp with both the 24-105 RF lens and all my EF mount lenses. I like having the fully articulating screen, especially when the camera is either on a tripod or on the ground. The autofocus has been fast, accurate, and is outstanding in low light. There are a ton of autofocus points, and the drag to focus feature worked really well for me. When it came to eye detection, it worked great for single AF or when the subject was fairly static. It was a little spotty with a moving subject, and even the face detection slightly missed focus sometimes. I ended up getting the EF and EFS to RF adapter, so I was able to use all of my L series USM lenses, which was really nice. And I'll show you a lot more in the more detailed review, but I was really happy with the image quality. The battery life was good enough for me. It's rated for somewhere between 350 and 370, and I have a ton of LPE6 batteries. An area where I was disappointed was burst or continuous shooting. The EOS R shoots at 5 frames per second when shooting with servo AF or continuous autofocus. You can jump this up to 8 frames per second if you don't need continuous autofocus. So while this camera will be fine for sports photography, there are other options on the market that offer much faster burst mode. Another area of disappointment is the fact that there is no built-in intervalometer, so you have to use an external one to do time-lapse with individual photos. There is a time-lapse movie mode in both 4K and Full HD that delivered really nice results. And I ended up using it instead of my intervalometer because it's faster and it didn't require me to bring another tool. Now finally, there's only one SD card slot. This is most likely not going to be an issue until it is. I've been shooting for a long time and I've only had one card fail on me, so I'm not going to sit here and tell you that this is a deal breaker for me. I'm just surprised that it's not an option, and I could see how this would be a turnoff for some professionals. Overall, for photography, on the good side, we have a sensor that works really well and offers plenty of resolution. I like the skin tones and the overall color. The autofocus in low light is excellent. The articulating screen is great when you're working at challenging angles. It's nice to have a good level of weather sealing. And finally, the Wi-Fi and Bluetooth make it easy to transfer images and share them. On the bad side, it's on the larger and heavier side, so some people might look for something smaller. The pupil and face detection were not always accurate, but I need to do more testing here. Burst shooting is not as fast as some people would like. And finally, there is no built-in intervalometer, but there is a 4K time-lapse movie mode. Okay, let's move on to video. One of the things that I was looking forward to was shooting 4K 30 video, and not just that, but 4K video with dual pixel autofocus. This is a major advantage over something like the M50, where you could shoot only 4K 24, and then on top of that, the autofocus system would switch to contrast detection instead of dual pixel. There are a lot of reasons to shoot 4K video, and there are some reasons not to, so you have to decide for yourself whether that's something that you want or not. Okay, back to 4K video. Right off the bat, you get crushed with a 1.8x crop when shooting in 4K on the EOS R. That's a lot. We're talking about a nifty 50 becoming a 90. So that's immediately going to be an issue on the wide end of the focal length spectrum. But it will give you more telephoto on the other end. So my 70 to 200 is now a 126 to 360 if I'm shooting in 4K. But at least I could use my 10 to 18 EFS lens with the EF/EFS to RF adapter and still get about 18 to 32 millimeter focal range. The color and the quality of the video is really nice, and as usual, I love having the fully articulating screen when I'm in front of the camera or using the camera on a slider. The last 5D that I used for video was the Mark III, and I love having continuous autofocus with a full frame sensor, at least when I'm shooting 1080p, which is what I mostly do. Moving on, the EOS R doesn't have in-body image stabilization and relies primarily on lens-based IS. It does offer two modes of digital image stabilization, which work better in 1080p than in 4K. I'll get into this in more detail in the full review, but I wanted to share my initial findings at this time. As I mentioned in pretty much every video, if you actually want to get great results, you should never count on camera or lens IS, and you should use a 3-axis gimbal. I look at in-body and lens-based IS as an added bonus and not as the primary tool I rely on for buttery smooth footage. Once again, the battery life was pretty good for me, and as I mentioned before, I have so many of these batteries, and I also use an AC power adapter kit for continuous power when I'm in the studio. The last thing I wanted to mention is something that of course I knew before getting the EOS R. But seriously, Canon, it's almost 2019 and I can't get 1080p at 120 frames per second? With all the things that I love about Canon, this is going to be the single reason why I end up using another brand for slow motion. The EOS R does give HD or 720p at 120 frames per second, but come on. I don't even have enough time in this video to mention all the different cameras that I could buy for $2,300 that would offer 120 frames per second at 1080p. And I'm not sure if it's processing power, and I know I can get a C200, but I want something smaller and more portable that would give me that functionality. At least I can get 1080p at 60 frames per second, so I can do slow motion at 50% if I edit at 30 frames per second, but 120 would just be so much better. And finally, if you're looking to stream using the EOS R, you'll be happy to know that it does offer a clean HDMI out, so you should be good to go. So overall for video, on the good side, we have 4K 30 frames per second internally at 8-bit 420 and externally at 10-bit 422. I like the overall color of the footage, and the dual pixel autofocus worked really well for me. The articulating screen is great when you're in front of the camera or using it on a slider or on the ground, and the battery life was pretty good, and if you've been a Canon user, you probably have stacks of compatible batteries. And then finally, there is a clean HDMI out if you want to use this camera for streaming. On the bad side, there's a serious 1.8x crop factor when shooting in 4K. There's no in-body image stabilization. There's only one card slot, which could be a problem, and there's no 1080p at 120 frames per second option for more versatile slow motion. Alright, so what do I think of the EOS R after about a week of using it? Is it a perfect camera? No. But is it the horrible camera that so many people say it is? Not at all. It's a good camera that does a lot of things really well and of course has some shortcomings. I'm happy with the image quality for both photography and video, and the color is that awesome Canon color that I'm used to. For photography, I enjoy using a full frame sensor for that extra shallow depth of field, And it's great to be able to use all of my L series USM lenses with the adapter that I got. The 24-105 RF lens is very sharp and the focus is fast and accurate even in very low light. I'm still getting used to the new controls and I really don't like the new touch multifunction bar, but I'm still giving it all a fair chance and I'll give you my final thoughts in the more detailed review. For video, it's nice to have 4K 30, although you pay the price with a 1.8 crop factor. It's always great to have the dual pixel autofocus, and the articulating screen is great when I'm in front of the camera or using a slider. Battery life was pretty good, and I love having a clean HDMI out for both 10-bit 422 and for live streaming. As I mentioned, there is no in-body image stabilization, so this isn't going to be a good camera for handheld video. There's only one SD card slot and there is no 1080p at 120 frames per second. I really hope that my first impressions of the Canon EOS R were helpful. If they were, please let me know by leaving a comment, giving this video a thumbs up, and if you haven't yet, join the community by hitting the subscribe and notification buttons. You can always find me on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at Tech Gear Talk, and you know what I always say, buy it nice or buy it twice. Good luck and see you soon.